Good evening, and welcome to the Imagine Austin speaker series on climate migration. How could sea levels rise impact the United States, including Central Texas? My name is Kathleen Fox, and I'm with the City of Austin's Planning Department, and I manage the Imagine Austin speaker series. Before I hand off the presentation to our moderator, Laura Patino, I have a few housekeeping items. First, today we have on-screen live captioning. To view the live captioning, click the closed captioning icon below on the bottom of your screen. And if you are on a mobile device, you need to click the three dots to open the menu bar further. If at any time you need assistance, you may send a direct message to the production team in the chat, and we will do our best to respond right away. Drop us a note to ask for help, or if you missed any of the instructions, thank you very much for your attention. This staff event is being recorded, and your questions, if you have any, will be taken after the presentation, but you can type them in the Q&A widget. Which we will get to after Dr. Matt Hauer finishes his presentation. The Imagine Austin speaker series at its core is an opportunity to promote and implement the policies of the Imagine Austin Comprehensive Plan, the City of Austin's 25-year plan for the future through shared dialogue and mutual learning. We accomplish this by inviting thought leaders, both locally and nationally, to give several talks a year in fields such as land use planning, transportation, housing, public health, social equity, and sustainability to promote and implement Imagine Austin policies. Today's event is sponsored by the Planning Department of the City of Austin and the Office of Resilience. At the end of this webinar, please fill out the survey that we use that to improve our programming and get suggestions for future speakers and topics. I will now hand this webinar off to Laura Patino, the Chief of Resiliency with the Office of Resilience, who will be moderating this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathleen. Hello all and welcome to the Imagine Austin speaker series. My name is Laura Patino and I'm the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Austin. I work alongside departments, including the Planning Department, to develop and implement a comprehensive resilience plan that addresses the complex challenges that we face today and in the future as a city. This means climate disasters, man-made disasters, and also the integration of day-to-day challenges we face. As part of the city's Imagine Austin Speakers series, we always get to learn more about important topics that impact our day-to-day in our lives. Today, we have a wonderful guest speaker, Dr. Mathew Hauer, and I'm excited as today's topic is one that is much relevant to what Austin is experiencing: climate migration. Climate change forces us to consider how changes in our environment impact the way we live and where. Floods, fires, extreme heat. But we also know that this is a global issue. How much of our population is changing, growing in some areas while declining in others because of climate change. So I'm happy that Dr. Hauer is here today. He is an Associate Professor of Sociology at Florida State University and a faculty affiliate in the Center for Demography and Population Health. His expertise is at the intersection of demography, migration, population projections, and climate change. He published a recent article on sea level rise and human migration, which describes one of the most costly and permanent consequences of climate change. Dr. Hauer has received the Cozzarelli Prize from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine for Best Paper in the Social Behavioral Sciences published in the Proceedings of the National Academies. He has received twice the E. Walter Terry Award for Best Paper on Applied Demography, and the University of Georgia has also awarded him an Excellence in Research Award for his dissertation on sea level rise and human migration. He has been featured in more than 400 media outlets that have covered his research, including the Time magazine, the New York Times, the Guardian, and the Washington Post. Also National Geographic. So Dr. Hauer's publications appear in a diverse set of journals, including Nature Climate Change, Proceedings of the National Academies of Science, Demography, Environmental Research, Demographic Research, Population and Environment, Statistical Modeling, and Population Research and Policy Review, among many others. Prior to arriving at Florida State University, he spent nearly a decade directing the Applied Demography program at the University of Georgia. So we are excited to have Dr. Hauer here today as we learn about his fascinating and award-winning research on climate migration. I ask that you use the Q&A widget or place questions in the chat. As we go through his presentation, we will have an opportunity to ask these questions and dive deeper into his presentation afterwards. So we are lucky to have him today, and it is my pleasure to welcome him to our webinar series this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. That was a very gracious introduction. It's really great to be here talking about some of my work. Most of it is focused around climate change and migration related to sea level rise. And for people, I'm sure in Austin might be thinking, well, why are we talking about sea level rise when we're not coastal? But you'll see as we go along, thinking about demographic change and sort of how it applies. So I'm going to focus on some new work that I've been doing around a concept of demographic amplification, especially as it relates to climate migration. And while most of the work is sea level rise, I will have some sort of broader sort of lessons for other climate hazards as well. So it won't just be sort of sea level rise by the end. So I want to start with sort of a quick reminder. 40% of the US population lives in a NOAA designated coastal community. So when we think about something like sea level rise, a large part of the US population is going to be threatened sort of as a baseline. At the same time, coastal communities continue to be some of the most rapidly growing areas, both domestically and across the world. So we really have this kind of confluence between population change and climate change. When we think about sea level rise then, and we think about climate migration, sea level rise tends to dominate our understanding of climate migration. If you think about the stressors and the hazards associated with climate change, people live in very hot areas, and some people live in very cold areas, and some people live in very dry areas, and some very wet areas. But generally, people don't live underwater. So we end up with very strong language about what the implications are for sea level rise as it relates to human migration. And almost always, this is just a sampling of some of the literature over the last 15 years. And oftentimes the language that people use is very strong for the scientific literature. Now, when people try and model out the climate migration, they oftentimes have a couple of drawbacks. As a demographer by training, I really think about the demographic drawbacks that people have. And one of them is this concept of demographic amplification. So oftentimes when we think about just migration in general, but for here, climate migration as well, we tend to focus on the migrants themselves. So sort of taking one person from one location and kind of putting them in another. But we don't think about the other additional population processes that those migrants are going to affect. And namely in population processes, these are just going to be mortality, fertility, and migration. So this sort of amplification is really two components to it. One is a fertility effect, where young migrants, when they move, could start a new family in their destination. So if they were going to have offspring, for instance, their offspring would have been in their origin and are now going to be in their destination. So even though you move one person, the net effect might be more than one. And the other effect is what we call the gravity effect. So as migration occurs, the demand for additional services changes as well. So migrants, when they move to a new location, they put additional pressures on the area. So you need more dentists and waiters and construction workers and lawyers and so on in the destinations. And conversely, you need fewer of those people in the origins. So it's sort of this gravity effect where you end up with additional migration because of this migration. So we haven't, oftentimes when we do this kind of modeling, we don't really use or think about this sort of amplification effect. But as I'm going to show, with this second order effect, if you will, right, not the primary effect, which is the migrant themselves, but these sort of secondary processes, turns out to be very significant. In most climate migration models, and my own, I'm just as guilty of this in some of my past work as well, we often just think about rearranging the migrants across space. So we take one person from one area and we put them in another area and we kind of call it a day without consideration for these ancillary population processes that are actually very significant. The other thing that kind of gets neglected in some of this work is the underlying demographic factors that kind of drive part of migration. So what you're looking at here is just the probability of migrating over age, across age. This is using all US data. If I remember right, this data comes from 2020, so right before the pandemic. And so the peak ages for migration are right around your mid-20s, where people are moving for educational reasons, to start a family, for a job, and those kind of things. The dots just correspond to the median age in the United States in 2020 and in 2100. So as the US ages, the background migration probabilities are likely to drop as well, as people have, lower probabilities of migrating into middle age. So if we don't capture this type of demographic dynamics when we think about migrants and we just kind of move them across space like a chess piece, we're very likely understating the demographic implications of climate migration because we're neglecting these additional factors. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a model that we built. I'm going to speak at a very high level, so hopefully I'm not going to get too into the weeds. But to try and model out this kind of climate migration, we built a database of all the major environmental displacement events in the United States since 1980. So we have about 40 years worth of data across the entire US at the county level, so over 3,000 counties. And with this database of environmental events, we built a statistical model in order to predict migration using this as our data input. So essentially, how do people react or how do they migrate after not just like a major hurricane, like maybe Harvey or Katrina or Sandy, but also for in the database, there's wildfires and there's tornadoes and there's hailstorms on crop damages, and there's all sorts of different environmental hazards. We also built a demographic model in order to project population change, and we plugged in the statistical model in it to try and figure out how demographic amplification would occur with sea level rise migrants. This is just, I like this slide simply because it shows how good our statistical model performs. And so the performance on being able to predict how populations would react to an environmental displacement are very, very good. It also shows the differences in the model too. We're looking at very rural areas where the total population is under 5,000 people. And at the same time, we're looking at very urban areas where the county population is over 500,000. There's right around 300 counties with over 100,000 people. So these counties with 500,000 are very large. And our performance is exceptionally well, with really good predictive probabilities. Our demographic model that we plug that statistical model into predicts migration into and out of and to and from every county in the United States until 2100. And using this demographic model, we build three primary population projections. The first one we just call base, and it's our sort of climate agnostic projection. This is going to be our model where we just made a projection without considering climate change, sort of what would occur had no climate change actually occurred, or had we accounted for climate change in any of our models. So we kind of think about that as our climate agnostic model. We also build a model that only incorporates migration. We call this our displacement model. In this one, people are allowed to move in reaction to climate change, but they're completely inert in the model. So essentially, we move somebody to a new location, and then they don't age, they don't start families, they don't die, they don't migrate again, they really don't do anything except for we're taking one from one area and putting them in another. This allows us to do a comparison with how the other sort of moving pieces around the chessboard, how that compares to our amplification. And lastly, we have our amplification model. This is the fully integrated demography that can occur. Migrants can start families, they can attract other migrants to another area, and they can move again, and so on. So we end up with this really nice, fully integrated demographic model. Now I'm going to show a little bit of a complicated table, but I'm going to walk you through it. And it just has to do with climate modeling and how, I guess, complicated it's been over the last few years. So this model uses two different background climate modelings and tries to put them together. One is called RCP and the other is called SSP. So the RCPs are representative concentration pathways, and they're a physical modeling basis. And the only thing you really need to know about them is that 8.5 is a large amount of warming in 2100. This is like everyone's driving huge pickup trucks, that kind of thing. And RCP 2.6 is like everyone's driving a Prius or an electric car or something similar to that. We have a low amount of warming. So it follows a nice sort of like 8 is high, 2 is low. The shared socioeconomic pathways, the SSPs, are a little bit different. They don't follow the same kind of schema, but they come with nice names. So SSP1 is considered the sustainability future. That's the future where everyone's driving electric cars. SSP2 is just middle of the road. So this is sort of like, okay, we don't know. Some people are driving electric cars, some people aren't. And then the only other one to know about is SSP5, which is the fossil fuel future. So we modeled out here, you can see also the sea level rise under each scenario, the number of migrants, that's the displacement model, and the demographic amplification, that's the fully integrated population model. We modeled at the most 1.2 meters of sea level rise, but for RCP 8.5, we're looking at about 0.8 meters, which is just over 2 feet, but not quite 3, somewhere between 2 and 3 feet. And then, of course, 2.6 is half a meter. So when we look at the middle scenario, which would be RCP 4.5 and SSP2 for middle of the road, we find that sea level rise would displace about 1.5 million people in the United States, but it would turn into about 15 million people that would change locations. So this is that demographic amplification effect. And so you can kind of think about this as well as like, a retiree maybe in Buffalo, New York, they're getting ready to retire. They could retire to Miami and they decide, you know, I don't know if I'm going to retire to Miami, and they choose instead a place like maybe Asheville, North Carolina. We wouldn't traditionally consider them to be a climate migrant, especially not in that middle line with the 1.5 million, but they're very clearly migrating in response to climate change. On the high end, well, with SSP5, RCP 8.5, SSP5, we get about 3.4 million migrants, and that turns into 28 million people changing locations in the United States. And on the low end, we get 840,000 migrants and about 8.6 million people changing locations. So oftentimes, the difference between the migrants and the amplification is about a 10-fold increase. So it's rather significant. This is what it looks like graphically for all the coastal counties in the United States. And so that black line, that's our base. That's the agnostic projection. The displacement is just the number of migrants, and then the amplification is the fully integrated demographic model. And if we take the difference between the line that is base and displacement, that's where we get that 1.5 million. And the difference between base and amplification is 15 million. If you notice, the uncertainty on these are very wide. And this is owing to two primary factors. For one, the sea level rise modeling itself is highly uncertain. The difference between 3 feet of sea level rise and 6 feet of sea level rise in Miami, for instance, is approximately an order of magnitude. So 3 feet of sea level rise might turn into 100,000 people that would have to move in Miami. 6 feet of sea level rise turns into 1 million. So we're looking at a very wide uncertainty. And then, of course, we also have the population uncertainty, whether or not the demographic modeling is actually certain or determined in these models. So these two interact to create a very large amount of uncertainty. But still, even with that uncertainty, a 15 million person difference is a very large amount of change that we could expect. If we look in some of the origin areas here, I just have Miami-Dade in Dare County, North Carolina. Dare is in Outer Banks County. It doesn't take a whole lot of sea level rise to cause a major demographic amplification. So under RCP 4.5 SSP2, Miami-Dade would lose about 28,000 people, but that turns into 250,000 fewer residents in Miami by the end of the century. In Dare County, if you look at that red line, it's starting to plateau at the bottom because Dare starts running out of people that could be displaced. And again, you see 8,500 people that would be the displacement, the difference between the black line and the blue line, but it leads to almost 40,000 fewer residents in Dare County. Now, on the flip side, we do have climate destinations, and we're starting to notice in this modeling the emergence of several of them. Here, I've got Nashville, I've got Denver, a suburb outside of Denver, and I've got Portland, Oregon, essentially. And again, you can see how a small amount of migrants turns into a very large amplification or population effect. In the case of Rutherford, it just takes about 35,000 migrants to turn into about 250,000 additional residents. Again, almost 10 times the number of migrants. When we look across space, you can see that Texas and the Texas Triangle has a very large number of in-migrants when we think about sea level rise. In fact, it's the highest concentration of climate migrants in the US for any state. The coastline is for the most part red, like if you look at Florida, for instance, but not every coastal community sees outmigration because of this model, because of sea level rise. And it's not just the California counties, which are blue and green, but there's a few in Florida as well, where even with sea level rise, people still are moving into those areas. Texas specifically has a number of large increases. In particular, the state would see almost 3 million additional residents. This is the largest increase for states among all 50 states for sea level rise migration. And if you look at by a county level, Williamson and Travis counties are the two counties that are really driving this increase. Both of them are Austin counties, and Collin County is just outside of Dallas, is the third county that has the largest increase among counties in Texas. On the other end, you can see Galveston, Brazoria, and Chambers being the largest out-migration counties in Texas, most of them being outside of Houston. So Texas has a very large increase, and in particular that Texas Triangle, Austin, San Antonio, Dallas, and Houston seeing the largest increases among any other state. Now, if we think about why people might move because of climate change, aside from thinking like, well, their house is underwater, people have to sort of weigh out the cost benefits of the move. They have to think about building new social networks and leaving their others behind. They have to think about the emotional cost, the economic cost, like the actual, the monetary costs of actually moving. And so people might actually migrate in response to a whole host of different factors. It could be policy incentives, it could be employment opportunities, it could be family and friend networks, socioeconomic reasons, and so on. And these reasons might operate both in concert or independently from one another, meaning it might not just be an employment opportunity, but it's a job maybe closer to family. And so you make a move. And that's just general migration decision making. The environment just becomes one additional factor that people play in why they might move. This is kind of a complicated graph. This is from the United Kingdom's Foresight report from about 10 years ago, which summarized a gargantuan amount of migration literature. But what I really want you to focus on is this sort of pentagon right in the middle, where these are the 5 primary factors that influences people's decision to migrate. There's environmental reasons, political reasons, social reasons, demographic reasons, and of course, economic. And so when we put it all together, when people decide to migrate, could be for any one of these reasons or a host of these. People might move because of property damage due to storm surge. Or they might have a preference for temperatures, right? Like they don't want to shovel snow anymore, or an area might be too hot. They might move for political reasons, like a home buyout, for instance, like what happened after Harvey quite a bit in Houston. It might be that they're close to retirement and now's the time to make a move. That would be like a demographic reason. Or they might have a desire to move closer to family and friends, like maybe their grandkids. And of course, there might also be an anticipatory reason, like they can't afford the damage for the next storm, whether it's a winter storm or a tropical cyclone. And sometimes it's not even any one of these reasons on itself, but might be several of these different reasons together as to why people might migrate or when they actually make that decision to migrate. Now, after they decide to migrate, there's 5 principles that help govern the destinations of environmental migrants, where people decide to move. And this has particular importance for understanding migration into Austin and into Texas for other climate hazards besides sea level rise. So generally, the first principle is what they call the immobility paradox. People generally want to stay, even if we think that they should move. So after Hurricane Katrina, there were tons of articles in like the New York Times and the Guardian about whether or not we should even rebuild a place that is actually below sea level and is only kind of propped up because of levees. So obviously, people want to stay if they can. Right? The immobility paradox. The second one is about the gravity law of migration. So generally, people move to nearer rather than farther locations, and they tend to move to larger rather than smaller destinations. And if you think about Texas, Texas is totally the gravity law of migration. There are at least 3 major cities, 4 major cities in Texas, of very, very large metropolitan areas, being able to pull a lot of people in through this sort of gravity effect of more people. People also move for increased wages and human capital. So people with higher levels of human capital are more likely to move, and they're also more likely to move further rather than nearer. And so, I mean, the economy in Texas has been doing really good. So you see a lot of reasons why somebody might move to Texas. People also oh, wow. That was I don't know what just happened with my keyboard. Hang on. Let me see if I can find this again real quick. My keyboard decided to completely act up. Let's try it. Let's see. Okay. Okay, I'm back in.
Awesome.
I'm going to use my mouse now. People also tend to follow pre-existing social and kin ties, so they move to places they're familiar with within their social networks. And people have been moving to Texas in large numbers for the last 30 years. And so these pre-existing social and kin networks are already embedded that people are following, sort of like greasing the rails, if you will, on making a move. And lastly, it's not just the economics that are important, but people move for social and cultural reasons as well, cultural capital. which make places attractive as destinations. We like to think it's just money, but it's really not just money. And again, Texas ends up shining in this area, as there's a number of social and cultural reasons as to why people would move to Texas. So again, if we go back to this map of migrants, you can see that the Texas and the Texas Triangle are going to score very high on almost all of the important principles of governing the migration destinations. So there's a lot of reasons why Texas would be a climate destination, a migration destination for other climate hazards besides sea level rise. So if you think about drought or extreme heat or crop damages and so on in the surrounding areas, the surrounding states from Texas, you can see why Texas might continue to see climate migration over and above just sea level rise. So to kind of wrap up, the amplification effect of demographic change is much, much larger than the migration effect. It's up to 10 times larger than the number of migrants themselves, which has, a supreme amount of consequences for thinking about service delivery, growth management, and so on. Texas also sees the largest population increase from this climate migration and from this demographic amplification as well. So it becomes the primary destination. And I think there's a number of reasons why Texas would continue to be a climate destination for other climate hazards, not just for sea level rise, which is really all I modeled here. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hauer, for this fascinating presentation. We have had so many questions trickle in throughout your presentation, and I'm excited to go through them and get a chance to answer as much of them as we can in the next 27 minutes. So like I said, we'll have about 27 minutes for a Q&A from this amazing audience, and I'll be reading those questions. So I encourage our viewers and our participants to write any questions that they still have as we continue this discussion through the Q&A widget, and we'll get into it. And of course, I want to say this wouldn't be a true webinar without minor technical difficulties. And so amazing that you were able to get those back on track. So how about we dig right in?
Sounds great.
Great. So the first questions that we have were more about the model itself. So we have a first question of, does this model anticipate the average migration distance?
So it does. So again, this comes back into like the gravity model, which is both distance and size. And so that is implicit in the model itself. The primary migration information, though, comes from the Internal Revenue Service from the IRS. So if you file your taxes in one location one year and you file them in another and in the next year, you would be considered a migrant. So all this is sort of like implicit within all of it. It's a great question.
Awesome. Thank you. The other question that we have regarding the model is regarding population change. So the question is, does population change slowly in your model, or are there clear breaks in migration trends when there's a large event, for example, Harvey, Katrina, or earthquakes?
Oh, that's a great question. So I would consider Harvey a black swan event. So I don't have those kind of things, those sort of like one-offs. Sort of like when would I be able to predict the next Harvey would be really difficult. And I guess if I could predict the next Harvey, I don't know if I'd be working as an academic. I'd probably be on Wall Street making a considerable large amount of money. But the nice thing about a model like this is it's designed to do these kind of like what if scenarios. And we've had conversations with my team in the past about like sort of modeling a Category 5 hurricane or something along those kind of lines in different parts of the US. As far as like other types of breaks, ones that are a little bit more predictable, yeah, we end up with what we call nonlinear responses. And if you I can show it, which was a good one was in oh, I don't have it in here, but yeah, I have one in Georgia, McIntosh County, which actually has a really good example of this, where it ends up, oh man, sorry, this is going crazy. Hopefully you can still see my screen over there. Where we end up losing, it gains population. McIntosh is coastal Georgia, so it is affected by sea level rise. It actually gains population and then loses population towards the end of the century. So it's weird, like it's a climate destination in the near term, but it becomes a climate sender in the long term.
Thanks so much. The next question that we have is related to the different climate hazards that we face within specifically our region. And so we learned today that about climate migration really due to sea level rise. And so one of the questions that we received was, how does this model, and does this model take into account climate migration due to heat, for example, Phoenix, or does it take just migration from the coast due to sea level rise?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and it's something I wrestle with almost on a daily basis when I think through this modeling effort. Right now, it only has sea level rise, but the model is flexible enough to do other climate hazards as well. And heat is actually the very next thing we plan to put into the model. It'll probably end up being heat will be next, and then likely will be something like wildfire or drought. But heat seems the very logical next step. So I don't have it in the model yet, but I am planning on putting it in and hopefully have results for what I consider to be a multi-hazard climate model sometime within the next few years.
And that's incredible, because as we look at our climate equity plan as a city, as we look at developing our comprehensive resilience strategy, as updating the Imagine Austin comprehensive plan, having that additional information would certainly allow us to be better prepared to create and draft solutions that are really going to meet the needs of our growing population. So the other theme of questions that I'm seeing trickle in is regarding the intersection of climate migration and the model with economic factors. So I'm going to read a few of the questions that are coming up around that theme, and maybe we can like couple in and answer based on what you've observed through your research in this space. So the first question is, do you have information on how people's incomes also affect their migration patterns? And then the other question that we have related to that is, how does development, especially in areas that don't have updated stormwater infrastructure, how does that cause some of that climate migration?
Yeah, so I'll start with the first one around income. So income is a really unique variable when we think about this, or a unique aspect of people. So those with so typically we think about those with high incomes are the ones who are most likely to move. And so we refer to generally those who would be unable to afford to move, but would want to move, as being involuntarily immobile, right? So they would like to move, but they can't afford to. And colloquially, we kind of call them trapped populations, right? They're kind of trapped. But at the same time, those who have the highest incomes are also those who are most likely to adapt in place. So like when it comes to sea level rise, the average cost of elevating your home is about $250,000. And so that would place only, a very select group of Americans who would be able to just sort of routinely afford to elevate their homes. So income plays this very interesting role in that it, in some sense, it traps people in place. And in some sense, it also can work in protecting them, but it could also work in facilitating their migration, but also staying in play and adapting in place. The data for this, though, for income, for looking at migration streams is extremely limited. As you can imagine, the IRS migration data, which is like phenomenal to begin with, is extremely sensitive and very protective of income information for migrants. So we have only the crudest income measures in that data, which tells us about destinations of people with income. And by crude, I mean like very crude, like one of the brackets is like $1,300 in income per month. So like over and above. So it's very, very crude. The other one was about stormwater infrastructure and how it might relate to climate migration. So I haven't done a whole lot on stormwater infrastructure, and so you're thinking about like precipitation events like rain and stuff causing flooding. And it also is some cases related to king tide flooding in coastal areas where you get sort of water coming up the storm drains. I know this happens in places like Miami and in Boston. This model right here is only surface level flooding and only from sea level rise. We don't have a whole lot on precipitation related flooding. And part of the reason for this type of model is because, after the storm, the water kind of recedes, but in the case of sea level rise, it's not receding, right? So I don't have a lot of good info on how stormwater infrastructure might relate to migration outside of just sort of speculating broadly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think part of this question also alludes to the fact that as we invest and reinvest in areas within the city to address different climate hazards, that does cause also local migration and displacement as well. So curious from that perspective, how, could we at some point really be looking at how these models apply at that hyper local level of neighborhoods to be able to understand what is happening across cities, even in areas that have higher risk versus others?
Yeah, so that's another area that's next for me, which is to go below
Cool. Well,
county.
we've had, like I said, a bunch of other
Oh,
questions to
sorry.
go through. So the other ones that are coming up here are more around the broader movements across the state, as well as what we're seeing here in Austin in comparison to other large cities in Texas. So the first one that we have is, why does Austin see a larger increase in migrant population compared to other large cities in Texas?
Yeah, so this is part of that network and the gravity effect as well. So Austin has been one of the most rapidly growing places in Texas, and its proximity to the coastline as opposed to Dallas also plays a role. So you have to kind of think about sort of balancing those different factors in a gravity model, the economic factors, the social, the cultural, the economic, and so on, all kind of coming as an interplay. Austin seems to be the center of it all. Or at least the data suggests that.
Absolutely. And I just lost my questions. Here we go. The next question that we have related to the same thing is, which areas in Texas are going to be the safest and most stable in terms of extreme climate in the next 50 years? How much do we need? Well, I'm going to stop there because the other question really talks about our power grid. So I do want to leave that question as a separate one. But again, the question was, which areas in Texas are going to be safest and most stable in terms of extreme climate in the next 50 years?
So safest and most stable is kind of hard to answer, since oftentimes it's related to your own personal levels of risk, and how, there's very, very risky areas in coastal areas in particular that people still continue to move to, and it's a level of risk that they're willing to tolerate. But one of the key things, though, is that essentially no place is spared from climate change. And I have a lot of conversations with places up north, and they still get hit by extreme precipitation events. They get heat dome effects. They also get affected by climate change, even if they think they might be a little immune to it. So what is the most or safest is kind of a tricky question to answer, and it really comes down to personal risk tolerance.
And along those lines, in terms of safest, we have a question regarding to preparedness. So the question is, does a city's climate preparedness impact migrants' decision selection and where to go?
I don't know. That's a very good question. So I actually don't know the answer to that. There's only a few national inventories of climate adaptation plans. And so that might be something we'll begin to answer within the next couple of years.
That's great. Thank you. This is a question related to our relationship with Houston. And so is Houston positioned to gain or lose population due to migration as a coastal community and as a coastal city?
Yeah, as I remember right, Houston is positioned to gain, but Galveston is positioned to lose. So most of the Houston metro area is pretty far inland at this point, stretching all the way up to Bryan County in College Station. So those areas are not, they're coastal, I guess, by definition, but I'm not sure I would consider them necessarily to be coastal. But on the whole, Houston is projected to gain through this. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I see some folks writing in the chat saying thank you as we answer their questions. So keep them coming. The other questions that we have are specifically about factors related to agriculture, water availability as well. And so we have a comment here that's saying local food and water availability, non-dependent on long distance transportation, dependent at present on fossil fuels, which is a factor to take into consideration for land management and planning. And so the question is, how would water shortage and proximity to agricultural land impact migration as we take into account all these other factors?
So I want to say that it is probably going to be important, but at the same time, I have yet to meet somebody who's moved because of water availability yet. It might be coming, but historically, and that's one of the challenges a lot of times with climate change is we don't have a lot of good historical analogs. Like with sea level rise, we have very few good historical analogs. If any, we have a couple storms that we try and draw from, but that's about it. So I'd like to say that it probably is going to play a role. I don't know when it's going to come into an effect.
Makes sense. Thank you. So the other questions that I have are more going back towards more of the technical space and more about your research specifically. Has Florida State University worked with any AI modeling engines to further delve into migration data research?
I am unaware. I don't know. I've had a couple proposals not get funded that were supposed to use AI and machine learning, but they didn't get funded, and so they kind of went kaput.
Is it something that you are going to look into and try to incorporate in your research moving forward?
Yeah, this statistical model uses a form of AI detection, an outlier detection algorithm that's machine learning. But it's not in the traditional sense of thinking about AI using like neural networks or otherwise to get very technical. So I'm very open to using machine learning. I just have not, except for on the statistical modeling back end.
And so what other researchers, think tanks, publications, or more should we as a group be following to get more information on this topic? Where do you suggest we learn more about this, if this is something that is of interest to both city staff, practitioners, community members, businesses, as they prepare for a rapidly growing population?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is a climate migration group called Climigration out of I want to say it's a European group, but they have weekly emails on different papers and so on that have all come out. Columbia University has a working group at CDAC, which is I can't remember what it stands for, but it's funded by NASA, I believe. They've done a number of research and a number of publications with the World Bank on international migration. Well, migration as it relates to climate change in international contexts. Oh, there was another one as well that was really good. It just slipped my mind. It was on research, it was on think tanks, and now I can't think about it. But there's a lot of really, oh yes, I remember now. The New York Times has a couple of really good writers. Jake Biddle is one, and so as Abram Lustgarten, and they have really, really great like popular, quote unquote, like pop publications on climate migration. I think Jake and I know Jake has published a book on climate migration. It's very accessible, and I think Abram is also working on one as well, Abram Lustgarten. And I'm sure there's others out there, journalists that are writing fantastic books on climate migration.
Well, there you have it, folks. Take a look at those resources, as well as I see someone has shared in our Q&A that there is a book by Jeff Goodall that was just released, "The Heat Will Kill You First," which is also recommended. It's not specifically about climate migration, but very relevant to some of the impacts that we face here locally. We have time for one last question, and I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to open it up for Dr. Hauer to give us a little bit of insight into and share some final words. So the last question that we have is, many other countries around the world are projected to have severe impacts from climate change. Does your model take into account international demographic changes? Uncertainty in policies on this might also make this a difficult calculation.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question, and he is exactly right that the uncertainty makes this very, very difficult to calculate. So, sort of on the technical side, we know that international migration has a lot more friction associated with it than domestic migration, and it's not just in the US. This is, kind of across the world, because there's generally a bureaucratic hurdle you have to kind of jump through in order to actually have a successful migration, which you kind of don't have to do domestically. But even still, the general the general understanding of other people doing climate migration work is that most of this climate migration is likely to be domestic as well. And again, because most migration is short distance to begin with. So it's likely to be domestic, it's likely to be short distance. And then on top of that, it becomes very difficult to actually try and incorporate international policies into whether or not somebody might migrate or not. You just look at the US, and in the last decade or so, international migration policies have kind of flip-flopped several times, and it becomes very, very hard to predict. This model here doesn't include international migration. It only includes domestic migration. And I imagine if we included international migration, it would probably make these numbers do nothing but go up, because it's completely missing from the model.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thanks for really answering all those questions that have popped up. I want to make sure that we have some time for you to be able to leave us with some parting thoughts. So thank you again for such an amazing presentation. We have learned so much, as well as from your responses to all the questions that we've received from our attendees. I guess the last thing that we want to hear from you and see if you can share some of your advice as you work with different cities in different areas around the globe is, how do we take this information and how can we transfer all this research to be able to make better planning, policies, decision making? And what are some examples perhaps of really those big picture policies that we need to really be thinking as we face this population growth in Austin? And finally, what is your hope for the future, as climate migration does seem like a pretty dreadful topic, as a lot of folks are losing their home and moving to places where they grew up to new areas. And so what is the hope in all of this process?
Yeah, those are great parting thoughts, hopefully. Yeah, so one of the things I really want people to think about or to kind of take away is that climate hazards are all interrelated in the US and kind of internationally. So we can't think of like like Texas was affected by Hurricane Katrina as well because of population displacement. Wildfires in California are also affecting Texas. So wildfires in Canada are affecting places in the US as well. So just because there's a climate hazard in one area doesn't mean that you won't be affected in some manner in another. And here I'm just using, real basic demographic modeling to look at this sort of demographic amplification, these second order effects. So climate change is localized in its impact, but it's also global in its impact as well. And the other thing I want to say about sort of the hope and so on, there's other communities in the US that are not battling sort of growth management challenges, but they're actually trying to generate growth. And I think a state like Texas, a place like Austin, I know it's difficult to think through all the challenges that climate migration might bring, but it's also, I think, a better problem than trying to think about how do you stem a population decline in the face of climate change as well. So I think that, Texas, Austin, and so on, the Texas Triangle are going to be well positioned into the future because it just has so much momentum behind it as well. My hope as well is that, using this kind of like peering into the crystal ball in some cases, is to hope to build a future that's a bit better for all of us. Whatever better is for you, as opposed to sort of getting kind of, surprised by some of these demographic changes.
Well, Dr. Hauer, again, thank you so much for your time today. It has been a pleasure to host you and be your moderator at the Imagine Austin Speaker Series. I will now transition it over back to our host, Kathleen Fox from the Planning Department. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
And Kathleen, I think you are muted. We cannot hear you.
No worries. Laura, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, on behalf of Kathleen, our wonderful staff are from Planning Department that put together this wonderful speaker series. Sorry, there's a lot of noise going on. We just want to thank you for coming to our webinar. On behalf of Kathleen, I really want to remind all of you to take our survey. The link is up on the screen now and will be emailed to all of our attendees, as well as find out more about the Imagine Austin Speaker Series at the URL provided as well. We want to really thank Laura. You did such a great job. We really appreciate you, and Matt as well, for being our esteemed speaker. Thank you again for everyone this evening, and have a great night.
Thank you all.